It was a quiet Friday night. He parked his truck outside a bar he hadn't visited in years. Not because it was special, not because anyone was waiting, but because once, this place made him feel like he belonged. Tonight, he didn't walk in with loud greetings. No familiar slaps on the back. No "where have you been" kind of questions. He sat near the window, ordered a glass of water, and watched the neon light reflect off his hands. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He was just done trying. If you've ever gone silent, not because you gave up, but because you gave too much and nobody noticed, stay with me. This story isn't loud, but maybe it's exactly what someone like you needs to hear. He used to be the one who always checked in, called first, stayed late, showed up even when no one asked. Birthdays, breakdowns, barbecues. He was there, because that's what good men do. But over time, something in him began to fade. It wasn't one big moment. It wasn't a dramatic goodbye. It was slow, like fog rolling in on a familiar road. You don't realize you've lost sight until you're already lost in it. He stopped texting first. Nobody noticed. He stopped showing up. No one called to ask why. He began to disappear. And somehow, the world kept turning like he was never there. That hurt in a way words couldn't touch. Not because he wanted attention, but because he finally understood his place as background noise in the lives he once made center stage. He didn't mind giving. He liked remembering your coffee order, liked driving you home when the rain got heavy, liked being the shoulder that didn't ask for anything in return. But kindness, without reciprocity, becomes expectation. And expectation, without gratitude, becomes erasure. People don't mean to take advantage, but they will keep taking until there's nothing left of you to give. He became the dependable one, which slowly turned into the invisible one. Because when you're always there, they forget how hard it is to keep showing up. He wasn't asking for praise. He just wanted to feel seen. Valued, chosen not for what he could do, but for who he was when he stopped doing. But no one asked how he was sleeping. No one noticed when his laugh grew quieter, when he started speaking less, when he stopped bringing dessert to dinner. He realized his presence was expected, not cherished. And that was when something inside him cracked. He still smiled. At church, at work, at neighborhood cookouts. He still nodded politely when people made plans they never kept. Still gave advice he knew they wouldn't take. On the outside, he looked fine. But that's the thing about strong men. They don't collapse. They don't scream. They fade, quietly, like ink in rain, because no one ever taught them how to ask for space. Or to say, "I'm tired," not from work, but from being everything for everyone. So he kept performing, holding the pieces, keeping the peace, until one day, he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man smiling back. Not because his face had changed, but because the smile no longer belonged to someone who felt alive. It was a performance, one that exhausted him, one that no one asked him to stop. That's the cruelest part. No one noticed he was fading, because he was still functioning, still doing what strong men are supposed to do. Be okay, even when they're not. There was no announcement, no last message, no long speech filled with blame or sadness. One morning, he just didn't reach out, didn't confirm the weekend plans, didn't ask how they were holding up, and no one followed up. No one noticed the silence. No one paused long enough to wonder. Has he stopped trying? It was brutal in its clarity. Not because they were cruel, but because his effort had become the only glue, and without it, there was nothing. He learned something that morning, something cold, but honest. You don't know how one-sided something is until you stop giving, and realize nothing comes back. That was the day he stopped chasing, not because he didn't care, but because he finally saw that caring alone wasn't enough. The first few mornings were the hardest. The silence in the house echoed like a storm. Every corner reminded him of how much space he used to make for others. He'd sit with his coffee, and for the first time, no one needed him. No urgent messages, No phone calls, no chaos to manage, just him and the stillness he once feared. But something strange happened. That silence, the one that felt like punishment, started to soften. He found comfort in small routines, feeding his dog, watering the plants, going for drives with no destination. He wasn't lonely. He was healing. Because for the first time in decades, his days weren't built around being useful, or available, or needed. They were just his. And in that stillness, he began to hear a voice he hadn't listened to in years. His own. He used to say yes to everything, helped out on weekends, picked people up when their car broke down, said no problem even when he was already overwhelmed. Now he chooses, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. If it drains his energy, he doesn't show up. If someone only calls when they need something, he lets it go to voicemail. People started to notice. Some called him distant. Others said he was changing. They weren't wrong. He was changing, because staying the same had nearly broken him. Now, if you want to be in his life, you walk gently. You show up with intention, or you don't come at all. He's not building walls, he's building doors. But not everyone gets a key. The world doesn't know what to do with men who no longer respond to guilt, to obligation, to fake smiles and shallow praise. Because when a man stops needing approval, he becomes hard to manipulate. And when he stops fearing abandonment, he becomes untouchable. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't argue. He just leaves. Not to teach you a lesson, but to protect his peace. He doesn't need to be louder. He just needs to be done. People used to admire how helpful he was, how kind, how easygoing. But they never asked what it cost him. Now he carries himself like a storm behind calm skies. Quiet, measured, but with power that doesn't beg to be recognized. You can't guilt him anymore. And that's what terrifies them. Because they were never ready for a man who doesn't need to prove anything. He no longer explains. If a space feels heavy, he leaves. If a conversation drains him, he stops answering. Not to hurt, not to punish, but because he has learned that peace isn't something you ask for. It's something you protect. He used to believe that walking away meant failure. That staying, no matter how tired he was, meant strength. But strength isn't staying in rooms that dim your light. Strength is choosing silence over shouting, distance over damage, and stillness over survival mode. He doesn't try to be understood anymore. He doesn't need people to get him. Because the peace he carries now is not for sale, not for trade, and definitely not up for debate. Once, he was terrified of being alone. He thought silence was punishment. He thought solitude meant he had failed. But now he's afraid of something else entirely. He's afraid of losing himself again. Afraid of becoming that version of him that smiled through exhaustion, that agreed to things just to be accepted. That version who said yes when everything inside him screamed no. Who stayed just so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. He will never be that man again. Not because he's cold, but because he remembers the cost. And the cost was too high. People say, "You've changed." They're right. Because he finally understands that the real loss isn't being alone. The real loss is being surrounded by people who make you feel invisible. He doesn't chase anymore. He doesn't argue. He doesn't try to prove. He simply lives. Quietly, deliberately, without apology. He gets his coffee, walks his dog, reads in the morning sun. He laughs, but only when it's real. He speaks, but only when it adds peace. And he loves but not to be loved back. His peace is no longer a reward. It's his armor. It's his choice. He doesn't need to be seen, celebrated, or saved. Because now, he is no longer building a life that looks good on the outside, but hollows him from within. He is building something quieter, but stronger, more solid, more his. And if you've ever disappeared just to survive, if you've ever walked away just to breathe, then no, you are not broken. You are building, not louder, not faster, just deeper, quietly, steadily, and this time, for you. If this story feels like yours, say it in the comments. Peace didn't make me cold. It made me whole.